Hello everyone, it's Underhill and welcome back. I have only recently finished the first season of House of the Dragon. I will admit I was one of these people that just dragged their feet. I dragged my feet over watching this show. I didn't watch it all as soon as it came out. I didn't watch every episode as soon as it came out because I just felt like the way Game of Thrones ended, I just couldn't see how this show could really kind of like step up to the mark and kind of like undo what had been done. As soon as Game of Thrones ended, I just stopped reading all the books, just unplugged myself from the universe of Westeros and just carried on. And one thing that I will say right at the start of this video is this show had a colossal task. Like, I don't think a lot of the commentary and a lot of the punditry that I've seen on this show, I don't think a lot of them fully appreciate how much of an uphill battle this show had. I mean, call me petty, call me a petty person, but I went into this show wanting to dislike it, and I know that sounds a bit ridiculous, but I kind of was like, I was kind of pre-aimed. I was already ready to dislike it just based on my experiences with the way Game of Thrones ended. So the fact that I walked away from this first season thinking it was absolutely fantastic is nothing short of a miracle. It just goes to show that that miracles can happen in TV, and this seems to be one of them. And of course, this is something that a lot of people have already commented on. It's done incredibly well. Its viewing figures have done incredibly well. I've did quite a lot of review material on Rings of Power, and then one of the things that was constantly talked about while Rings of Power was going on was how well House of the Dragon is doing alongside that, basically. And it just from the outset, it is a phenomenal show. It is an absolutely phenomenal show. And it got me thinking, is it a better show than Game of Thrones? Or at least is the first season better than the first season of Game of Thrones? Because it's hard to compare a show that fully completed over the course of a decade nearly with a show that's only had one season. And I found this article, this Screen Rant article that I think does capture some of the thoughts that I had coming away from this first season. So we'll just jump straight into this article. House of the Dragon versus Game of Thrones Season 1, which is better? Game of Thrones Season 1 premiered in 2011. I remember the premiere. I remember all of the ad material and everything leading up to the premiere. I was actually super psyched, and I was mainly psyched because if Sean Bean was in it. When I found out the first season was coming out, I was like, oh, well, if Sean Bean's in it, then it's going to be very good. Game of Thrones Season 1 premiered in 2011 and began the on-screen adaptation of George R.R. Martin's universe, while House of the Dragon Season 1 returns there 11 years later, with the two shows which had a better Season 1. Both Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon Season 1 have 10 episodes run by HBO, both fantasy dramas, blah, blah, blah. Despite them both being set in the same world and part of the same franchise, each is independent. In fact, House of the Dragon is set about 200 years before the events represented themselves in Game of Thrones. You see, this was the one point of confusion that I had, actually, with House of the Dragon, is my understanding, thinking back, however painful the memory is, back to Game of Thrones. The Game of Thrones storyline is told in such a way that it made the dragon seem like it was kind of ancient history. I know that there were discussions throughout the seasons of Game of Thrones. I can't remember which episodes, of how dragons like gradually got smaller and smaller, and they were sort of like phased out over a long amount of time, and then they vanished, and then you were almost so far away from the events that if Game of Thrones, like Westeros, might have even had dragon deniers at that point. That was sort of like the distance in time that I thought we were between the House of the Dragons, between Game of Thrones and then like the end of the Dragons. But I could be wrong. I'm not overly familiar with Game of Thrones lore. Like I said, I did sort of just chin the books off when the TV series started to nosedive a little bit. So perhaps that's just my failing my failing from having not read the books there. In fact, House of Dragons is set about 200 years before the events represented in Game of Thrones, and as specified in the first episode, exactly 172 years before the birth of Daenerys Targaryen. Again, I don't know, just Targaryens are talking like it was like ancient history, or at least that's what I thought coming out of Game of Thrones, that they talked about the dragons like they were ancient history. 172 years is not ancient history. Both series take place in Westeros, with House of the Dragon offering a more narrow focus on the Targaryens family, whereas Game of Thrones follows various story arcs, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So we jump into the actual comparisons here. The characters of Game of Thrones Season 1 versus the characters of the House of Dragon Season 1. Both House of the Dragons and Game of Thrones features a large cast. I mean, that's become one of the defining features of this franchise, is you do have a stacked cast of characters made up of both younger and more established actors like Matt Smith, Paddy Considine, and Olivia Cook for the prequel, and Sean Bean, Peter Dinklage, and Lena Headey for the original one. See, this was one of the things that I do think that Rings of Power did incorrectly. Not that this is a Rings of Power bashing episode, but you do have some experience alongside the newer actors in this show, and it does show through, because people have talked about it online, but Paddy Considine was an absolute standout. So was Matt Smith and Olivia Cook. They were absolutely fantastic in this series. So I'm no showrunner, but it does seem like having experience on set allows newer actors to shine, in ways than if you just have a completely new set of cast that people haven't seen before. But maybe that's just something unique to Rings of Power. Who knows? Both first seasons feature strong performances and complex, well-rounded characters, as seen in the Game of Thrones, as well as in the characters of the prequel. One of the strongest suits in both the House of Dragons and the Game of Thrones is not only their outstanding cast, but also the presence of grey characters, most of whom are not entirely villains or heroes. However, House of the Dragon features an impressive amount of character recast throughout the season, something that didn't happen in the Game of Thrones, and which caused some criticism towards the prequel for its constant changing of the actors. I actually thought all of the recasts were done really well. I didn't see a single... There was no point where the recast didn't hit home for me, to be honest with you. I thought all of the actors at all stages did really well. Even the child actors as well. I mean, child actors could be really hit or miss, and yet the child actors all throughout the show were fantastic. When I got to the point that I realised that the next episode was a time jump, I was a bit apprehensive when I found out that everyone was getting changed and there was going to be this big jump and this big recast. I thought, oh my God, is that going to work? But that's just because I liked the characters that were set up in the first handful of episodes. So I was pleasantly surprised when the recast ended up being just as good, if not better. So very happy with that. I do agree that the characters, I would say the characters of the House of Dragon season 1 are more interesting than the Game of Thrones characters in the first season. Paddy Considine again absolutely smashes it. So I would give, on this first point, I would give it to House of the Dragon so far. I would say House of the Dragon has you caring a lot more for the main characters at the end of the season than Game of Thrones did. House of the Dragon Season 1 story versus the Game of Thrones Season 1 story. House of the Dragons and Game of Thrones may be two separate products, but the stories in their respective first seasons seem to mirror each other. Yeah, I suppose they're both about king, death, and succession. In both cases, a war of secession is started by the death of the current king, Viserys in House of the Dragon, and Robert in Game of Thrones, as doubts are cast over the legitimacy of their parentage. Yeah, I was quite interested. I guess in medieval, in a sort of medieval fantasy setting, lineage and parentage probably were hyper important, and that's something that George R. R. Martin seems to take really seriously when he's talking about noble houses and the institutions of medieval England in particular. I think is what he's largely been inspired by. So it's no surprise that this is a big theme in House of the Dragon as well. Both of them also present the same issues, with the first couple of episodes serving as a set-up, resulting in a slower pace in terms of storyline. The first season of Game of Thrones is, however, perhaps more successful in setting up many of its different story arcs while making the audience care about them. Yes, but House of the Dragon doesn't have as many, so it has fewer story arcs overall. I mean, you get the impression that Game of Thrones was set up knowing that everyone was sort of like going to all go their separate way and have like really independent stories, but this felt like a more intimate show, so like a more just straight look at the Targaryen family itself. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I just think it's a different show with a different purpose, as they'll come with high stakes for the characters involved, whereas House of the Dragon has fewer characters and plots to develop and may therefore result in a less complicated storyline for the audience to follow. It's far more contained, and I would say kind of like all of the trajectory of all the characters are all sort of like heading towards this central point, which is the start of this civil war. So in that sense, it is easier to follow. Whether or not that makes it better, I don't know if you can really say that House of Dragons story is fundamentally better than the start of the Game of Thrones story, so I'm not going to get on this point. I'm not really going to give it to either of them, I don't think. Next, House of the Dragon Season 1's world building versus that of Game of Thrones. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess House of the Dragon had the benefit of having everyone having already seen Game of Thrones, presumably. There is a big difference between House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones, and that is how the former is set in much smaller context than the latter. Yep, Game of Thrones has to deal with what is essentially a bigger world than that of the House of the Dragons. Yeah, and one of the things that is, I felt like the one benefit that this show has, just because of the lore of Westeros, is that because all of these characters, or a lot of them, have dragons, it actually makes fast travel and fast movement around the kingdom very believable. Whereas we know from certain other recent fantasy shows that have come out that the character pace is set in the source material, and then when really meaningful fast travel happens, that sort of undoes events in the story. It feels a bit jarring. But in this show, if a character flies off somewhere, it is conceivable that they could get there in like maybe less than a day. So the world does feel smaller in House of the Dragon than it did in Game of Thrones, but that's because Game of Thrones, well, I guess they just didn't have this method of travel available to them, and because we follow in all the Targaryens as the main characters, they're the ones whose travel we need to care about, really. Essentially, much of the world building House of the Dragon seems to be dependent on is taken from Game of Thrones itself. The original series sets up not only the geography of Westeros and Essos, in which both events take place, but also the relationship between the families and their roles. That is true. I mean, that is true. You already are familiar with the locations. No doubt about that. I would counter that by saying, all right, so the show has that as its advantage. However, the show has as its disadvantage all of the baggage that comes with now being associated with the original TV show. However, House of the Dragon does add to this world building by going into more details about the history and traditions of the Targaryen family, along with the elements associated with them, such as the dragons and High Valyrian. Yeah, I'm not really going to give it to either of them here, I don't think. I mean, Game of Thrones did have to do some world building. A lot of that was actually done through the very, very clever intro cinematic that Game of Thrones had. That was basically just a pan shot of the map. That was absolutely spot on. So I don't think you could say that House of the Dragon's world building was better or worse than Game of Thrones because they both build on the same world. However, again, the fact that House of Dragons had to overcome the baggage of the Game of Thrones name, I never thought I'd say that. If you told me I would 5 years ago, 4 years ago, I would say that because it overcame that, then, getting you once again interested in the world and getting you once again interested in everything that's happening goes to House of Dragons credit. So, the action and CGI, admittedly, with nearly 20 million per episode, House of the Dragon has a much bigger budget than Game of Thrones did in Season 1, at roughly 6 million per episode at the beginning of the show. Therefore, it goes without saying that the prequel CGI is overall more impressive, as evident by the dragon. See, for me, it's not even just the CGI. I'm not one to sit and reflect on cinematography and shots and what I consider to be impressive like that, but I actually feel just like the way it was done, there were some shots, particularly in the final episode that took place in the Stormlands. There were some shots that were actually just fantastic and got me thinking, actually put the idea in my head. That was a fantastic shot. That was actually nice to look at. The one where the Queen's son arrives as a messenger and he sort of looks over to the side and he sees, honestly, what looks like it could just be a massive dinosaur, just this absolute Leviathan just off in the distance in the rain. That was a fantastic shot. There's also the shot in the air where, again, it turns the air into an ocean basically, and has this young prince on his dragon back, on the back of his dragon, just look like he's dealing with this Leviathan coming from under the water to get him. Absolutely fantastic shots in the air with the dragon battles. There was also a really good one in, I think it was episode 6, where Aemond takes Vhagar and he's telling him to stop so he doesn't kill him. And there's a shot of the young Aemond with his hand out between the two eyes of the dragon. I thought that was a fantastic shot as well. So yeah, I'm not one to sit and reflect or to overly comment on cinematography. I just sort of let it happen and enjoy it. But there were times throughout the show where I actually stopped and I thought to myself, someone's put a lot of care, a lot of thought and attention into just how to present that scene, and it just looked fantastic. Whereas Game of Thrones just kind of was like, he's the dragon, boom, plop, there it is. And you know, they did look good, but I would say that final episode of House of the Dragon had a Jurassic Park feel to it. You know, in the Jurassic Park where it's raining and the T-Rex comes, it had that Jurassic Park vibe to it, where it was sort of like, it was like this monster of the storm, and I just thought it was awesome. So there's no way I can't give that to House of the Dragon. Whether or not you call it CGI or whether or not you call it just cinematography, I don't know. Just the way in which it was executed, the way in which the presentation of the dragons were executed was just better. Although the audience did see the dragons in the final episode of season 1, every single episode of House of the Dragon is populated by dragons. Not only are there many more compared to Game of Thrones, but they're also bigger and far more distinguishable from the other. Yeah, I really liked that aspect of it. I mean, this show, from what Game of Thrones did, was it George R. R. Martin in particular is right. He was like very like, oh, if you living in medieval Europe, if you want to live in one of these might equals right sort of places, you better know what that means, because if you're bigger, you genuinely get your way. And I like the fact that it's like translated over to like dragon lore as well. It was like, yeah, well, they're dragons, yeah, but there are bigger dragons. And just like the pecking order of humans in these cruel societies, which is why, you know, the Hound and the Mountain in Game of Thrones, which is why they were such important characters, I guess, because they really embodied the cruel world. It was like, if you are that much bigger than someone, you are going to get what you want in most situations. And here it is. I do feel like Vhagar is kind of like the dragon, is the dragon embodiment of that. It's like, might equals right. My dragon is bigger than your dragon. So really like that coming out of this season as well. In terms of the action, House of Dragon also seems to be the better of the series. While the majority of the Game of Thrones season 1 focuses on political conflicts, House of Dragon already depicts battles and conflicts with dragons in the early episodes of the season. Why House of the Dragon is better than Game of Thrones? I do agree with the conclusion that this author comes to, is that House of the Dragon season 1 is better than Game of Thrones season 1. But I would caveat that by saying that it's possible, I don't know, but it's possible that I'm viewing Game of Thrones through like muddy glasses. Obviously, it's hard to separate the early seasons of Game of Thrones from the later seasons of Game of Thrones. So I can't separate in my head how it ended with how it started. So it could just be that I'm looking on the start of Game of Thrones just outright less favourably because of that, which may well very be the case, so just bear that in mind. While Game of Thrones may be the more novel product, House of the Dragons could count on established viewership based on a cinematic universe. Yeah, but I would say that I don't know if this was actually a good thing. I think the show did well in spite of that established viewer base, rather than because of it, if I'm being completely honest. So, therefore, while both series present a compelling story delivered by a strong cast and directional writing team, it is not easy to say which one's better overall. While they both have their strong suits, with Game of Thrones Season 1 setting up plot lines that come back later in the seasons, House of the Dragons benefiting from beautiful visuals and outstanding CGI, House of the Dragons ultimately has an element Game of Thrones is missing, one that makes its first season the better out of the two shows. Game of Thrones received widespread criticism for the amount of sex and nudity in the show, especially in the first season, particularly when scenes were not necessary to the plot. On the contrary, controversial scenes that involve violence and nudity in the House of Dragon are justified by the plot to make the show overall more appealing to the audience. Okay, I find that a bit of a funny reason to then, after all the other points of discussion, to then conclude that that's the reason why House of Dragon is better. I might do a separate video on that, on its treatment of sex and stuff like that, but I would just say, based on the 4 points of discussion, the way it handles action and CGI is better, and the cast's better. The cast just has more standout characters, and I guess because each cast member of House of the Dragon gets more screen time, you just get closer to them and you just end up liking the characters more, and the fact that they're actually delivered really well by fantastic actors makes it even better. So yeah, I'm actually going to just say that I do think House of the Dragon Season 1 is better than the way Game of Thrones started, but let me know what you think in the comments down below. Alright, cheers.